Albert Harrison, a wealthy and arrogant man, agreed to a bet that would change his life in ways he could never have predicted. Accustomed to winning in both business and personal endeavors, Albert thrived on competition. At a lavish New York party, his close friend Stanley made a bold and unexpected challenge that piqued his interest. "Let's see if you can win this one, Albert," Stanley said with a smirk. "I bet you wouldn't have the guts to marry a woman who doesn't fit your usual type." Albert, known for dating beautiful and glamorous women, was momentarily taken aback. But his pride and competitive spirit wouldn't let him refuse. Raising an eyebrow, he asked, "And what's the prize?" Stanley's grin widened as he raised his champagne glass. $1 million to the winner. But you have to marry her and stay married for at least 6 months. Albert, fueled by the thrill of the challenge and the financial incentive, agreed without hesitation. The woman Stanley had in mind was Chloe Richards. She wasn't conventionally beautiful, but she was confident, independent, and strong-willed, qualities that made her vastly different from the women Albert was used to. To Albert, she was just another obstacle to overcome, another deal to win. Days later, Albert received more details about Chloe and grew increasingly intrigued. Used to being in control, he wondered how he would handle someone so unyielding. Their first meeting was arranged at a luxurious restaurant. When Chloe arrived, Albert immediately noticed how different she was. She didn't seem fazed by the upscale setting or by his reputation. Instead, she met his gaze with unwavering confidence. "You must be Albert Harrison," Chloe said, taking her seat and extending her hand. "And you must be Chloe Richards," Albert replied with a controlled smile, shaking her hand firmly. Chloe wasted no time. "Let's not beat around the bush," she began, her tone direct. "I know why we're here. I know about the bet, the terms and the conditions." Albert was surprised by her bluntness but didn't show it. "And yet you still agreed to meet," he said, curious about her motives. Chloe paused, then answered, "Let's just say I have my reasons. I'm not naive, Albert. 6 months may seem short, but a lot can change in that time. If you think you can manipulate or control me, you're mistaken." Albert smiled. Chloe was proving to be more of a challenge than he had anticipated, which only made her more intriguing. As their meeting ended, he found himself thinking about her more than he expected. She wasn't like anyone he had met before, and that alone sparked both curiosity and admiration. Their second meeting was at a modest cafe, a far cry from Albert's usual luxurious haunts. Chloe had suggested the location, and Albert, eager to understand her better, agreed. When he arrived, Chloe was already there, sipping tea and wearing a calm smile. She greeted him warmly, her demeanor less guarded than before but still brimming with confidence. "I thought you preferred 5-star restaurants," Chloe teased as Albert sat down. "Sometimes it's good to break the routine," he replied, trying to sound casual but feeling slightly out of his element. After some light conversation, Chloe got to the point. "If we're really going through with this, I want to make a few things clear," she said, setting her tea down. "I'm not interested in your money or your luxurious lifestyle. 6 months is 6 months, and I plan on walking away from this exactly the same as I entered." Albert studied her carefully. He could tell she was being truthful. Chloe wasn't like the social climbers he was used to, she had no interest in wealth or status. "So what do you want, Chloe?" Albert asked, genuinely curious. "Freedom," she answered without hesitation. "I want you to know that even though we're entering into this agreement, I won't be controlled by you. I have my own life, and that's not going to change because of a temporary marriage." Albert smiled, unexpectedly impressed. If freedom was what Chloe wanted, he had no problem granting it. To him, the marriage was just a formality to win the bet. "Fine," he agreed. 6 months. After that, we go our separate ways." Chloe nodded, studying him carefully as if to ensure he truly meant it. She had her own plan in mind and was determined to stick to it. Deep down, she suspected Albert might try to manipulate the situation, but she trusted her strength to resist his influence. The wedding was a cold, businesslike affair. To Albert, it was just another contract to fulfill. Afterward, he brought Chloe to his sprawling penthouse, a symbol of his immense wealth. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views of the city, and every inch of the space was adorned with the finest decor. This, Albert thought, is where I'll win her over. But Chloe wasn't impressed. Standing by the window, she gazed out at the city with a look of calm defiance. 6 months, Albert. Not a day more, she said firmly. Albert smirked, confident her resistance was temporary. He was used to women bending to his charm and wealth. Surely, Chloe would be no different, or so he thought. In the days following the wedding, Albert tried everything to impress her. He showered her with expensive jewelry, designer clothes, and invitations to lavish trips. But to his frustration, Chloe refused it all. "I don't need these things, Albert," she would say with a quiet calmness that only deepened his irritation. Albert, who had always gotten his way, found himself challenged for the first time. It wasn't about the bet anymore. It had become personal. He needed to win Chloe over, not just to prove he could, but to reassert the control he felt slipping away. He began playing more aggressively, trying to assert dominance in their relationship. He suggested she quit her job, insisting, "You don't need a paycheck anymore. Your role as my wife is more important." Chloe's response was firm. "My role is to honor our agreement, Albert. Nothing more." For every move Albert made, Chloe countered with unwavering grace. The battle for control turned into a complex dance of defiance and admiration, and Albert began to realize he might be the one losing ground. Albert Harrison was not used to being outmaneuvered. He prided himself on being in control of every situation, every relationship, and every outcome. But Chloe Richards was unlike anyone he had ever encountered. Their marriage, born out of a bet, had quickly become a battlefield, with Albert testing the limits of his influence and Chloe refusing to yield. Albert began by asserting dominance in small, calculated ways. He manipulated schedules, made Chloe wait for hours, and deliberately sabotaged meetings she considered important. Each tactic was designed to frustrate her, to remind her who held the power. But Chloe remained steadfast, her composure unwavering. She was a wall Albert couldn't break, and her resilience only deepened his determination to win. Their dynamic grew more strained with time. Every conversation became a minefield, with Albert trying to assert control and Chloe deftly deflecting his attempts. Her words were sharp, her responses measured, and Albert found himself increasingly frustrated by her refusal to bend. One evening, after yet another failed attempt to intimidate her, Albert confronted her directly. "I don't understand you, Chloe," he said, his voice tinged with both frustration and curiosity. "Any other woman would be thrilled to live in this kind of luxury. But you act like it's not enough. What do you really want?" For a moment, Chloe was silent, her eyes fixed on his. Then, with a calm intensity that caught him off guard, she replied, "What do I want? I want respect, Albert. I'm not a piece on your chessboard. You think money can control everything, but it can't buy dignity or integrity. You might have all these things around you, but you're empty inside. And that's what you can't stand." Her words hit Albert harder than he anticipated. No one had ever spoken to him like that before, and the truth in her statement made him feel exposed. For the first time, Albert felt as though he was losing, not just control, but a part of himself he had always taken for granted. But instead of backing down, Albert doubled his efforts. He tightened his grip on Chloe's life, cutting off her professional contacts and sabotaging her projects. He wanted her to feel trapped, to see that without him, her life would be harder. Yet, with every move he made, Chloe countered with a quiet determination. She was unshakable, and her defiance only made him more desperate to break through her defenses. Then, one night, Chloe turned the tables. You think you're in control, don't you? She said, her voice calm but laced with something he couldn't quite place. But what you don't realize is that I have a plan too. And when the time is right, you'll see this game is much bigger than you ever imagined. Albert stared at her, caught off guard. For the first time, he realized he might have underestimated her. A flicker of doubt crept into his mind. What if Chloe was the one playing him all along? The tension between them grew with each passing week, an invisible thread stretched taut, ready to snap. Albert's attempts to dominate only seemed to strengthen Chloe's resolve. She refused to crumble, and her quiet defiance started to have an unexpected effect on him. He began to see her differently, not as a challenge to conquer, but as someone who was slowly disarming him in ways no one else ever had. One night, after a particularly heated argument, Albert found himself alone in the penthouse, staring out at the glittering city below. The view that once gave him a sense of power now felt hollow. He couldn't shake the feeling that Chloe was different, not just stubborn, but truly extraordinary. And that realization unsettled him. Even Stanley, his closest friend, noticed the change. "You're different, Albert," Stanley remarked during a dinner. "Normally, you'd have everything under control by now. But it seems like this woman is challenging you in a way no one else has." Albert forced a smile, unwilling to admit the truth. He hated the idea that Stanley might be right. But deep down, he knew something had shifted. Chloe was no longer just part of a bet. She was becoming something more. When Albert returned home that evening, he found Chloe reading on the couch. She looked up as he entered, her expression calm but expectant. "Can we talk?" he asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Chloe closed her book and nodded. "Of course," she said, as if she had been waiting for this moment. Albert sat across from her, struggling to find the right words. "Finally," he said, "what are we doing here, Chloe? This started as a game, a bet. But I don't know what to think anymore." Chloe studied him for a moment before replying, her voice steady and deliberate. "I'm not playing, Albert. I never was. From the beginning, I accepted this marriage for reasons that go beyond you. I don't care about the money or your control over things. I'm here for something bigger. And if you haven't realized that by now, maybe it's time to open your eyes." Albert felt a knot tighten in his chest. He wanted to push back, to reassert his authority, but her words had a weight he couldn't ignore. "You have your secrets, Chloe," he said, frustration seeping into his voice. "But what irritates me is that the more I try to understand you, the more I realize I'm not in control. And I hate that." He stood abruptly, pacing the room, unable to contain the storm of emotions brewing inside him. Chloe watched him calmly, then stood and approached him, stopping just inches away. "Albert," she said softly, her voice carrying a gravity that silenced him, "this isn't about control. You've spent your whole life trying to dominate everything and everyone around you. But sometimes, the real strength lies in letting go." Her words lingered in the air, and for the first time, Albert felt something shift inside him, a crack in the armor he had worn for so long. Albert Harrison was a man who thrived on control, a puppeteer of power whose life revolved around bending others to his will. Yet, Chloe Richards had proven to be his greatest enigma, an immovable force in the face of his calculated dominance. Their 6-month marriage, born from a frivolous bet, had spiraled into a twisted chess match of control and defiance. But tonight, Albert felt the weight of the game shift, the balance tilting in a way that made him uneasy. He found her on the penthouse balcony, seated like a queen surveying her empire. The city lights framed her silhouette, but there was something foreboding about the calm air she exuded. Albert approached, his footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent room. "I need answers, Chloe," he said, his voice breaking the heavy stillness. "I can't take this game anymore. You have to tell me the truth." Chloe didn't turn immediately, as if savoring the moment. When she finally rose and faced him, her eyes gleamed with an intensity Albert hadn't seen before. Her voice, usually measured and calm, carried an edge he couldn't ignore. "The truth?" she said, a bitter smile forming on her lips. "Do you really want to hear it?" Albert nodded, though every instinct told him he wasn't ready. The tension in the air was suffocating, and he braced himself for the answers he had been chasing for weeks. "You have no idea who I am," Chloe began, her tone icy. "You see people as pawns in your games, Albert. But this time, you were the pawn. I've been playing this game from the very beginning." Her words struck him like a blow. Albert's carefully constructed world began to crack. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, his voice faltering. Chloe stepped closer, her gaze piercing. "Do you remember the name Richards?" she asked. "Of course, you don't. People like you never do. My father owned a small company, honest, struggling, but full of hope. That was until you came along and crushed it." Albert's mind raced. He had destroyed countless businesses on his climb to the top, but he couldn't recall the name. He tried to speak, but Chloe cut him off, her voice rising with the fury of years of buried pain. "You ruined him, Albert. My father lost everything because of your greed. He couldn't handle the shame, the despair. Do you know what it's like to watch someone you love break before your eyes? He took his own life because of you." Albert stumbled back, the weight of her words rendering him speechless. His empire, built brick by brick on the ruins of others, was now exposing the lives it had destroyed. "My father's death left my mother and me with nothing," Chloe continued, her voice trembling with emotion. "While you thrived in luxury, we were left to claw our way through poverty. You didn't just destroy a business, you destroyed a family." Albert's legs felt weak. He reached for the edge of the couch to steady himself, but no amount of physical stability could counter the storm inside him. "When I heard about your bet," Chloe said, her tone shifting to cold calculation, "I saw my chance. I approached you on purpose. I accepted this sham of a marriage because I wanted to make you feel powerless, to taste even a fraction of the pain you caused." Albert's chest tightened as her words unraveled the illusion of control he had clung to. For the first time in his life, he realized he had been outplayed. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Chloe, I didn't know." "You didn't know because you never cared," she snapped, stepping closer, her voice sharp and unrelenting. "You never looked back at the destruction you left behind. But I'm here to make sure you never forget. I don't want to destroy you, Albert. That would be too easy. I want you to live with it. I want you to feel the weight of every life you ruined." Her words fell heavy in the room, sealing his fate with a finality he couldn't escape. Chloe stepped back, her expression unreadable, and turned toward the balcony once more. The silence between them was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of the city. Albert sank onto the couch, his mind reeling. The empire he had built, the power he had wielded, it all felt hollow now. Chloe's revelation was a mirror, forcing him to confront the man he truly was. The cost of his success had finally come due, and the debt was one he could never repay. As Chloe stood by the balcony, her figure illuminated by the city's glow, Albert realized he had lost more than a bet. He had lost a part of himself. The game he thought he controlled had been turned against him, and he was left with nothing but the emptiness of his own making. Albert Harrison had always been a man in control, a ruthless businessman who bent the world to his will. But now, for the first time, he was the one being manipulated. Chloe had flipped the board, and the life he had so carefully constructed was slipping through his fingers. Her revelation about the destruction of her family and her father's tragic death had shattered him. Yet, it was what came after that truly unraveled the man he believed himself to be. After her chilling confession, Chloe left Albert alone in the penthouse, abandoning him to the crushing weight of his guilt. The air felt heavier, suffocating. He stood motionless, trying to process the truth, but the enormity of what he had done left him paralyzed. He wanted to run after her, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness. But no words could justify the pain he had caused. In the days that followed, Chloe's silence became her weapon. She ignored him entirely, moving through their shared space as though he didn't exist. At breakfast, she sat in cold silence, her eyes never meeting his. Albert, who was used to commanding attention, now found himself invisible in his own home. Her indifference was like a blade cutting deeper with each passing day. He tried to reach her, to bridge the chasm that had formed between them. "Chloe," he called out one morning as she adjusted her coat, preparing to leave. "We need to talk." She paused but didn't turn around. For a moment, Albert held his breath, hoping for a response. But Chloe said nothing. She simply walked out, the soft click of the door echoing in the stillness of the room. The emptiness left in her wake was unbearable. Albert realized he was losing her, not just her attention, but her acknowledgement of his very existence. Chloe's silence wasn't the only punishment. Slowly, methodically, she began to dismantle the world Albert had built. Meetings at his company were mysteriously rescheduled, deals fell apart, and projects he had championed began to fail. He knew this wasn't coincidence, it was Chloe. She was pulling strings behind the scenes, unraveling his life with the same precision he had once used to destroy others. At home, she maintained her distance. Meals were consumed in silence, and when Albert attempted to engage her, she met him with icy stares or cutting remarks. One evening, he found her in the living room, calmly reading a book. Desperate, Albert sat beside her. "Chloe," he began, his voice low and pleading. "I know I've done terrible things. I've caused you so much pain. But please, can't we talk? Can't we at least try to fix this?" Chloe slowly closed the book and looked at him, her expression colder than ever. "Talk," she repeated, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Words won't erase what you've done. Do you think saying you're sorry will bring back my father? Will it undo the years of suffering you caused?" Albert's voice cracked. "I'll change. I swear I will. I just want to make this right." Chloe stood, her presence towering over him despite her calm demeanor. "Change," she said, her voice sharp. "What you do now won't fix anything. It won't bring back the people you destroyed. This isn't about redemption, Albert. It's about you finally understanding the pain you caused, and living with it." Her words left him hollow. For the first time, Albert realized there would be no forgiveness, no easy path to redemption. He had to face the consequences of his actions, and Chloe was determined to make him feel every ounce of the weight he had placed on others. As the weeks passed, Chloe's tactics grew more calculated. Albert found himself fighting a losing battle both at home and at work. His frustration turned to desperation as his once impenetrable empire began to crumble. One night, after a particularly disastrous business meeting, he returned home to find Chloe on the phone, laughing. He caught fragments of her conversation and realized she was discussing his failures at work. When she hung up, he was waiting. His face was pale with exhaustion and anger. "You're tearing everything apart, aren't you?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and despair. "At work, here, you're destroying my life." Chloe met his gaze without flinching, her arms crossed. "Destroying your life," she repeated, her tone almost mocking. "I'm not doing anything you didn't already do to yourself. I'm simply giving back what you gave. Don't worry, Albert. I won't ruin you financially, that would be too easy. I want you to live with this. I want you to feel every little loss, just as I did. Every day, I want you to watch everything you built crumble." Albert's shoulders slumped under the weight of her words. He was powerless in the face of her calculated vengeance. The man who had once controlled everything now stood amidst the ruins of his life, his empire collapsing around him. Chloe's presence was unrelenting, her silence deafening. Albert realized he was no longer the player in this game, he was the piece being moved, powerless to stop the inevitable checkmate. Albert Harrison was no longer the man he once prided himself on being. Chloe's revelation had stripped him of his confidence and shattered the illusion of control he'd built his life around. For weeks, he wandered through his home like a ghost, his arrogance replaced by a suffocating sense of guilt and helplessness. Chloe's silence and indifference were more effective than any outburst of anger. She didn't need to scream or argue, her quiet disdain was punishment enough, her every glance a reminder of the pain he had caused. Albert tried to redeem himself, but his efforts were met with cold rejection. Chloe's punishment wasn't swift or loud, it was deliberate, measured, and agonizingly slow. Every small defeat, every ignored word, every look of disdain, chipped away at his resolve, leaving him a shadow of his former self. One night, Chloe confronted him again, her voice calm yet sharper than any blade. She stood over him as he sat on the couch, her expression unreadable but piercing. "Albert," she began, her tone devoid of emotion, "you took something from me that I can never get back. Now I'm returning the favor. And you will live with that for the rest of your life." With those words, she turned and left him, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Albert was left alone, the weight of her sentence pressing down on him like a vice. There was nothing more to say, Chloe's punishment was already in motion, and Albert knew he would never be the same. In the days that followed, Albert realized that his apologies were meaningless. Words couldn't undo what he had done, and he understood that to even attempt to earn Chloe's forgiveness, he would have to prove his sincerity through actions, not promises. The first step was giving her space. He needed to show her that he respected her boundaries, that he wasn't going to pressure her. At the same time, he wanted to remind her that he was still there, subtly, thoughtfully, and without imposing. Albert began paying attention to the details of Chloe's life, the small things he had overlooked before. He noticed her love for peonies, the way she took her coffee strong and unsweetened, the little routines that brought her comfort. He didn't follow her or invade her space, but he committed these details to memory, seeing them now as a roadmap to understanding her. One afternoon, Albert went to a florist and bought a bouquet of peonies. He didn't hand them to her directly, he knew she would reject such a gesture. Instead, he left the bouquet on the kitchen table without a note. It was simple but deliberate, a quiet acknowledgement of her preferences. When Chloe returned from her walk, she found the flowers waiting for her. Albert watched from a distance as she paused, her expression unreadable. She picked up one of the peonies and smelled it. It was a small, fleeting moment, but to Albert, it was a sign. She hadn't rejected the gesture outright, it was a step forward. Encouraged, Albert continued with these small acts of consideration. He made her coffee the way she liked it and set it out on the table before leaving the room. He left little comforts for her, a book she'd been reading, folded neatly with a bookmark, or a warm blanket draped over the couch. He never forced a conversation or a meeting, he simply showed he cared in ways that required no acknowledgement. Still, Chloe remained distant, her walls firmly in place. Albert knew it would take time to break through her defenses. But he was determined to prove he was different, that he was committed to earning her trust and respect, not through manipulation or control, but by meeting her on her terms. One particularly cold evening, Chloe stood on the balcony, wrapped in a blanket as she watched the city lights. Albert hesitated before joining her, a cup of hot tea in his hands. He approached cautiously, keeping his tone gentle. "I thought you might like something warm," he said, extending the cup. Chloe didn't speak at first, but she accepted the tea, her gaze still fixed on the skyline. Albert stood beside her, silent, not wanting to intrude but wanting to be present. For the first time in weeks, the silence between them didn't feel unbearable. It was heavy, yes, but there was something different, something almost hopeful, in the stillness. After a long pause, Chloe broke the silence. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Albert took a deep breath. He knew this was a pivotal moment. "Because I've realized that words don't mean anything anymore," he said, his voice steady. My apologies can't fix what I did. What matters now is showing you that I'm trying to change, not for my sake, but because it's the only way I can begin to make up for the pain I caused. Chloe said nothing in response, but she didn't walk away either. For Albert, that was enough. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't absolution, but it was a beginning. For the first time, he felt that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to rebuild, not as the man he had been, but as someone better. I'm trying to show you that I'm changing, Albert said, his voice filled with sincerity. I want to be a better person, not just for you, but because I realized I need to be. Chloe held the cup of tea in her hands, her expression unreadable as the cold wind brushed past them. The silence stretched between them, but somehow, the tension eased just a little. Finally, Chloe spoke, her voice softer than Albert had expected. You can't change the past, Albert, she said quietly. I know, Albert replied, his voice steady, but I can change the future. For the first time that night, Chloe looked at him. The hardness in her gaze remained, but there was a flicker of something else, curiosity, maybe even a spark of hope. Albert could see it, she wasn't ready to forgive him, but he had touched on something, a possibility she might be willing to believe in. In the days that followed, Albert continued with his small, thoughtful gestures. While Chloe still kept her distance, she no longer rejected him outright. She accepted the flowers he left for her, drank the cups of tea he made, and even allowed brief, surface-level conversations during breakfast. The walls between them were starting to come down, though slowly and cautiously. Then, one evening, as Albert was getting ready to leave for a business meeting, Chloe surprised him. She walked into the room with an expression he couldn't quite read. Can you cancel your meeting? She asked suddenly. Albert stared at her, taken aback. She hadn't shown any interest in his schedule since their relationship had begun to unravel. He hesitated for a moment but then nodded, grabbing his phone and canceling the meeting without a second thought. This was the first time in weeks that Chloe seemed willing to spend time with him, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. They sat together on the couch, some distance between them, but this time the silence wasn't uncomfortable. Chloe seemed thoughtful, almost like she was processing everything that had happened over the last few months. I'm not ready to fully forgive you, she said quietly, breaking the silence. But you're showing me something different. I see that you're trying, and maybe that's the beginning of something. Albert's heart raced at her words. He knew he couldn't rush things, but this was progress, real, meaningful progress. It was just the beginning, but it was enough to keep his hope alive. He was ready for the long road ahead, willing to take every step if it meant earning her forgiveness, and maybe, in time, her love. The night passed with them talking about trivial things, but to Albert, it felt like a victory. He was slowly rebuilding something with patience, and Chloe was no longer the unreachable figure she once was. She was starting to let her guard down, and Albert knew he couldn't make the same mistake of underestimating her again. Still, a shadow lingered. Albert could sense that Chloe wasn't fully open with him yet, there was something she was still holding back, some secret she hadn't shared. And though he didn't know what it was, he knew he needed to be ready for whatever it might be. Weeks passed, and Albert dedicated himself entirely to proving to Chloe that he was a changed man. He cancelled work commitments, spending more time at home, ensuring he was available to her without pressure or expectations. He continued with the small gestures, making breakfast together, talking about everyday things. Gradually, the ice between them began to melt. Chloe no longer treated him with the same coldness, but there were still moments when she seemed distant, as if she was waiting for the right moment to reveal something. Then one quiet night, as rain softly tapped against the windows, Albert noticed a shift in Chloe's behavior. She seemed even more introspective than usual, distant, as if lost in thought. Albert didn't want to push her, but his curiosity got the better of him. There was something on her mind, something unspoken, and he had to know what it was. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, Albert spoke softly, almost nervously. Chloe, he began, his voice low, I know there's still something between us that you haven't told me. I can feel it. Please, if there's something you're holding back, I need to know. Chloe, sitting on the couch with her hands folded in her lap, took a deep breath. She didn't immediately meet his gaze, and the silence stretched on, agonizing. Albert knew he had to be patient, pressing her now could undo all the progress they'd made. Finally, she turned her eyes to him, and for the first time, he saw a mix of pain and resolve. "You're right," she said, her voice soft but heavy with emotion. "I've been holding something back. Something I didn't think I could tell you until now, but maybe it's time." Albert felt the air in the room tighten. He leaned forward, his heart pounding, knowing that whatever she was about to say would change everything. "Do you remember the company you destroyed?" Chloe began, her tone firm but her face filled with deep pain. "The one my father managed? I told you that you destroyed our family, and that's true. But, that's not all you destroyed." Albert looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice full of concern. Chloe lowered her eyes, her hands trembling slightly as she fought back tears. When she spoke again, her voice was a whisper, barely audible. "I was pregnant, Albert." The words hit Albert like a gut punch, knocking the breath out of him. He blinked, stunned, trying to process what he had just heard. He could hardly believe it. "I was pregnant," Chloe repeated, her eyes still fixed on the floor. "And when everything fell apart, when we lost everything, the pressure, the stress of it all. I lost the baby." Albert's world seemed to shatter around him. The ground beneath his feet felt like it was collapsing. The guilt he'd already been carrying for weeks grew tenfold. He hadn't just destroyed a company, a family, he had taken a life. "Chloe," Albert tried to speak, but the words were stuck in his throat, too heavy, too inadequate to express the devastation he felt. His voice cracked, choked with emotion. I didn't know. I never could have imagined," Albert stammered, his words hanging in the air. Chloe's eyes, already red from crying, met his gaze at last. The tears she'd been holding back now streamed down her cheeks, but even through her pain, there was a strength in her expression. "No, you didn't know," she said, her voice trembling with hurt and resentment. "Because you never cared to know. You destroyed lives, Albert, and you didn't even see the people in your way. I lost my baby, and you went on with your life like nothing happened." Her words struck him like sharp blades, each one twisting deeper into his heart. Albert wanted to do something, anything, that could somehow make up for what he had done, but he knew deep down that no words or actions could undo the damage he had caused. "I don't have the words," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper, full of regret. "I know what I did is unforgivable. And I'll never forgive myself for it. But please, Chloe, I'll do anything to try and make this right. Anything." Chloe stood still for a long moment, her eyes locked onto his with a mixture of pain and something else, maybe hesitation. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the weight of everything unspoken. Finally, Chloe took a deep breath and closed her eyes, as though making a decision within herself. When she opened them again, her expression had changed. The pain was still there, but there was something else in her gaze, a quiet resolve, as though she had come to terms with something. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Albert," she said, her voice raw but honest. "What you did, it was devastating. But," she paused, as though choosing her next words carefully, "I can see that you're trying. And maybe there's a chance, someday, that I can find a way to move forward. But it won't be easy. It won't be quick." Albert nodded slowly, his heart filled with a mix of hope and despair. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but at least Chloe was willing to consider the possibility of a future where forgiveness could exist. "I'll do whatever it takes," Albert promised, his voice steady with determination. "No matter how long it takes, I'll prove to you that I've changed. That I can be someone you can trust. Someone you can maybe one day forgive." Chloe looked at him for a moment longer, and for the first time, Albert saw a small crack in the wall she had built around her heart. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning, a fragile hope. "We'll see," she said softly, her voice tinged with both caution and something more. "We'll see if you can." The silence between them was heavy, but this time it wasn't suffocating. It was filled with possibilities. Chloe stood up and walked toward the door, leaving Albert on the couch. But this time, he didn't feel the despair he once had. He knew there was a long road ahead, but for the first time, there was a flicker of hope. The days that followed Chloe's revelation marked a transformative time for Albert. Her words echoed in his mind constantly, reminding him of the pain he had caused. He could no longer ignore the consequences of his past. But rather than sink into regret, Albert chose to use his guilt as fuel for change. He didn't just want to win Chloe's love back, he wanted to become a man worthy of her respect and the respect of everyone he had hurt throughout his ruthless career. That morning, Albert made a decision. He would no longer allow the past to define him. He would start over. The first step was to repair as much of the damage as possible, to show Chloe that he had truly changed. He began tracking down the families whose lives had been ruined by his past actions. His first visit was to the family of an old competitor, whose business he had destroyed years ago. Albert knocked on the door of a modest house in a neighborhood far removed from the luxury of his own. The man who answered was a stranger to Albert, but the pain in his eyes was all too familiar. "I'm Albert Harrison," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I'm here to apologize." The man stared at him for a long moment, disbelief written across his face. "Apologize?" He let out a bitter laugh. "What's that going to change now?" Albert stood firm. "I can't change the past," he replied quietly. "But I can try to help rebuild the future. I'm here to offer compensation, to help fix what I destroyed." Over the following weeks, Albert continued his journey of redemption. He knocked on doors, met with families, and offered not just money, but his time, effort, and a genuine desire to understand the lasting impact of his actions. He donated large sums to small businesses that had been affected by his corporate maneuvers, even setting up recovery programs to help other entrepreneurs rebuild their lives. Chloe observed all of this from a distance. She remained cautious, watching as Albert tried to make amends. She knew he was changing, but forgiveness wouldn't come easily. However, as time passed, she began to feel something new toward him: respect. For the first time, she saw that Albert's words weren't empty. He was genuinely transforming. One evening, Chloe stood on the balcony, watching the city lights twinkle below. Albert quietly joined her, his expression calmer than it had been in the past. He had just returned from another of his reconciliation visits, and something about him was different. More resolute. "How was it today?" Chloe asked, still gazing out at the horizon. Albert let out a deep sigh, one that carried months of effort and regret. "Tough," he admitted, "but necessary. Every conversation, every apology, it's a step toward becoming a better person. Not just for you, Chloe, for me too." Finally, Chloe turned to face him, her eyes searching his. She could see it now: the man standing before her wasn't the same person who had entered her life with arrogance and a bet. This was a man fighting to change, willing to do whatever it took to make things right. "I can see that," Chloe said softly but firmly. "And I want you to know that I'm ready to try. Maybe it's time we leave the past behind and build something new." Albert felt a wave of relief wash over him, a relief he hadn't even realized he had been waiting for. Those words meant more than he could express. Chloe was willing to give them a chance, not as the couple forced together by a bet, but as two people ready to start fresh. As their 6-month marriage agreement came to an end, something surprising happened. Chloe and Albert grew closer. Their conversations became less formal, less tense. They shared moments of laughter and connection. And in those moments, they began to realize that maybe, just maybe, they were building something real. Slowly, love began to bloom between them in a way neither had anticipated. What had started as a cold, distant arrangement had gradually transformed into something real, genuine, and heartfelt. The walls they had built around themselves began to crumble, and in their place, a new connection was formed. They weren't just fulfilling a contract anymore, they were rediscovering each other, seeing each other in ways they never had before. One evening, as the 6-month agreement was nearing its end, Albert prepared a special dinner. It wasn't just a meal, it was an expression of everything that had changed between them. He had no idea how it would be received, but he knew this moment was pivotal. They had come so far, and he didn't want to see it all fall apart. "Chloe," he said, his voice trembling with a nervousness he hadn't expected to feel. "I know our agreement is almost over, but I don't want this to end. I don't want us to end. I've fallen in love with you, Chloe. Truly. And I want us to continue, but this time as a real couple. No bets. No games." Chloe looked at him, a little surprised by the sincerity in his voice. But as she listened, something shifted inside her. The coldness that once defined their relationship had long since melted away, replaced by something softer, more tender. She realized, in that moment, that she had fallen for him too, quietly, without realizing it, over the past few weeks. "I love you too, Albert," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I want to try. I want to build something with you. But this time, as equals. As a real couple." A wave of happiness swept over both of them. They had come so far, from adversaries to partners in love. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were ready to face it together. Months later, Chloe began to feel a little different. Morning nausea, something she had never experienced before, led her to schedule a checkup. The results confirmed her suspicion: she was pregnant. When Chloe told Albert, his reaction was pure joy. He embraced her, laughter and tears mingling as he pulled her close. All the heartache and pain they had endured seemed to fade away in the light of this new beginning. "I want to do this right this time," Albert said, his eyes filled with determination. "I want to marry you again. But this time, for real. Not because of a bet. Not for any reason other than because I love you and I want to spend my life with you." Chloe smiled, tears of happiness spilling from her eyes as she nodded. "I want that too, Albert. This time, it'll be a real wedding. A fresh start." Their new wedding was simple, intimate, and meaningful. It wasn't a spectacle of glamour, nor was it rushed by business deals or wagers. It was just Chloe and Albert, surrounded by close friends and family, united by love, ready to embrace the future they would build together. Albert knew that he still had a lot to prove, not only to Chloe but also to himself and to the people whose lives he had hurt in the past. But now, he had a reason to fight for a better future, a life with the woman he loved and the child they were expecting. And this time, he was determined to be the man Chloe deserved and the father their child would need. As they shared a slow dance at the end of their wedding ceremony, Chloe rested her head on Albert's chest and whispered, "Who would have thought it all started with a bet?" Albert smiled, holding her close. "Who would have thought it'd be the best bet I ever made?" With hearts full of love, redemption, and hope, they stepped forward into the next chapter of their lives, together. Do you think Chloe made the right choice in forgiving Albert and marrying him? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Your participation means so much to us. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring narratives. Thank you for watching.